Dawn, September 11, 1599. Rome has not gone to sleep. The crowds began arriving at Ponte Sant'Angelo before the sun had touched the Tiber. They pressed onto the stone bridge in the tens of thousands, shoulder to shoulder, breath rising in cold columns against the early morning air, the smell of torch pitch mixing with the damp iron smell of the river below. Those at the edges of the bridge had nowhere to step. Some would fall into the Tiber before the morning was finished. Witnesses later reported watching figures swept under by the current and carried away, drowned in the act of bearing witness. The angel statues on the bridge, parapets held their poses. They had seen public executions from this bridge before. The carved stone wings did not move. A scaffold stood at the center of the bridge. A small axe rested against the wooden block. The papal guards were in position on all sides. The crowd went quiet as a figure in white moved through the gate and onto the bridge. Nobody turned away. Nobody was going to turn away. This is not a story about a girl who murdered her father. This is the story of a girl who did the thing the law had refused to do for her and was executed by the Holy State for the crime of surviving. It is also the story of a pope who received 60 petitions for mercy from Rome's most powerful cardinals, read them and set them aside, because beside those petitions on the same desk sat a different document, an inventory of the Cenci family estate. The numbers in that inventory were more persuasive. Before we walk the full length of this story from the remote mountain castle where the violence began, to the scaffold on Ponte Sant'Angelo where it ended, and into the Vatican chambers where a pope made his calculations, drop a comment with your city and country. Where in the world are you watching from? Hit subscribe and join Velours Spectre. You are watching Velours Spectre. Beatrice Cenci was born on February 6, 1577, into a Rome that operated like a machine with two gears, one for the nobility, one for everyone else. The Papal States had assembled, across 2 centuries of institutional consolidation, a judicial apparatus that functioned less like a court and more like a ledger. What went into the noble column came back out resolved. What went into the other column was processed differently. The Cenci family occupied the noble column with considerable weight. They traced their line to the ancient Roman gens Cincia and held one of the largest private fortunes in the city, buildings, land grants, liquid holdings distributed across multiple provinces. Her father, Francesco, had also accumulated a criminal file that occupied multiple pages in the papal archives by the 1590s, violent acts against members of his household, a sodomy charge in 1594. Released each time on noble bond, the mechanism through which Roman justice processed crimes committed by men wealthy enough to make accountability negotiable. His second wife, Lucrezia Petroni, had entered the household in the early 1580s. She would survive him by exactly 1 year. By the time Beatrice reached adolescence, Francesco's violence had become its own systematic operation, a routine the surrounding legal structure had already reviewed on multiple occasions and chosen not to interrupt. In his 1923 biography, Beatrice Cenci, Corrado Ricci documents how her written appeals to her brothers in Rome, describing what she endured inside the family house, were intercepted before they reached their destination. The letters never arrived. No one came. Rome's noble families understood this arrangement without being told. A man of Francesco's standing could conduct himself however he chose within his own walls. What that meant in practice, the household around him operated as a closed circuit. Those inside it, wife, children, servants, had no credible recourse to anything beyond it. The papal courts had already reviewed Francesco's conduct across several proceedings and released him each time. He understood this. The violence inside the Cenci house did not persist despite the legal arrangements surrounding it. It intensified because of them. Beatrice Cenci appears first in the historical record as an absence, the girl whose letters failed to arrive, whose name surfaces in Francesco's judicial file as a dependent rather than a subject. She was 22 years old in September 1599. The portrait, attributed to Guido Reni, painted decades after her death and now held at Palazzo Barberini in Rome, shows a young woman in a white turban, face turned at a 3/4 angle. eyes directed at a point slightly above the viewer. The expression is not tragic. It is unresolved, the way a question left open is unresolved. Her mother, Ercilia Santa Croce, died when Beatrice was 7. What followed was a childhood conducted entirely under Francesco's authority, a household where violence arrived without announcement and departed without consequence. She learned early what the law was. She learned what it was not. She wrote letters. She sought allies. She understood exactly which resources existed for a woman of her position, and when each one failed, she crossed it off her accounting. By 1597, she had exhausted every formal option. That year, Francesco transferred the family to La Pitrella, a castle he owned in the Abruzzi Mountains, approximately 100 kilometers northeast of Rome. The stated reason was never clearly articulated. The practical effect was precise. La Pitrella was remote. The nearest Roman authority was a significant distance away. The castle walls were thick. The mountain paths leading to it were few. She understood what the transfer meant. She had understood what was coming before she arrived. Beatrice Cenci did not plan the night of September 9, 1598 alone. Inside La Pitrella were the same people Francesco had relocated alongside her. Lucrezia Petroni, his wife, Giacomo and Bernardo, 2 of his sons, and Olimpio Calvetti, the household steward, responsible for the castle's daily management. For months they had shared walls with a man whose conduct had no external limit and no internal restraint. The isolated mountain location had not tempered Francesco. It had removed the last check on him. The plan that emerged had the structure of a logistics operation rather than a crime of passion. Wine, prepared with a sedative compound, an iron instrument selected and placed, a balcony high enough to make a fall plausible. The distance between the castle and the nearest village accounted for. On the night of September 9, 1598, Francesco Cenci was drugged. While he slept, an iron instrument was applied to his skull. His body was then moved to the balcony and thrown. Below, in the village, a housekeeper reported hearing a sound she could not classify. Not the wind, not an animal. Something heavier, with a landing that did not match stone. That single report would cost them everything. The plan was designed to conclude inside the castle walls, the body accounted for. The story closed before it left the mountain. But the unclassified sound traveled from the village to Rome through the normal channels of rumor and official inquiry. Francesco Cenci had enemies in the city, and he had assets that the Vatican was already aware of. The combination meant someone would eventually ask what had become of him. Giacomo, who had remained in Rome, was arrested first. The papal interrogation methods were not symbolic. He confessed within days. The inquiry reached La Pitrella in early 1599. They waited. Beatrice Cenci and the remaining household at La Pitrella were arrested and transferred to Roman custody in the spring of 1599. The papal judicial apparatus had access to interrogation methods that were neither ceremonial nor gentle, instruments designed to produce confession, applied by officials who understood what outcome the proceeding required. Picture this scene. Beatrice is not in a courtroom. She is in a room without windows, and the men in that room are not interested in her testimony. They are interested in her admission. She held longer than expected. Trial records preserved at the Archivio di Stato di Roma note that Beatrice refused to confess through the first phase of questioning and through the second. The notation marks the point at which the methods were escalated, and the point at which she broke. She confessed on the third session. Lucrezia Petroni confessed faster. She was older, and had spent nearly 2 decades inside the Cenci household calculating the cost of survival. She understood the room quickly. Bernardo, 12 years old at the time of the arrest, was also taken into custody. He had not participated in the events of September 9. He was taken anyway, because the state required the family complete in order for the proceeding to be structurally coherent. The confessions were documented. The case was assembled. The paperwork moved upward through the papal judicial system with the efficiency of an institution that had already determined its outcome before the proceedings formally opened. The trial record preserved what had happened at La Petrella. It also preserved what had happened inside the Cenci house before La Petrella, the abuse documented in Beatrice's own words, the history of Francesco's conduct recorded in the same archives now processing her death. The cardinals who read the complete file immediately petitioned for clemency, 60 of them, in writing. They were not naive men. They understood the legal precedent. Clement VIII was invoking. They were arguing something different, that a prosecution which punished survival while the conditions that produced it went unexamined was not enforcement. It was theater. What Beatrice Cenci could learn of the petitions confined inside Castel Sant'Angelo in the summer of 1599 is not recorded. The 60 signed documents from Rome's most senior cardinals, arguing that her prosecution punished survival rather than crime, were delivered to the Vatican. They did not reach her cell. She knew they existed. She likely understood what they contained. She did not know what Clement VIII would do with them. Ippolito Aldobrandini had been pope since 1592. He was a man of documented legal training and documented personal conviction, known within the Church for his interest in institutional reform, for his intolerance of what he considered moral disorder among the Roman nobility, and for a consistency of decision-making that those who worked with him described as resolute. He had not arrived at the papacy as an improviser. He understood the levers of Roman institutional power with the precision of someone who had spent his entire career inside them. He was also not the first pope whose family's financial position improved substantially during his tenure. Consider what the Cenci estate represented. The family holdings were among the largest private assets in Rome, buildings occupying some of the city's most valuable land, agricultural properties distributed across multiple provinces, liquid capital, in accounts that would have been significant by any standard. Under established papal legal doctrine, the estate of a condemned noble was subject to confiscation by the Holy See. From the Holy See it moved in whatever direction the Pope directed it. The Aldobrandini name began appearing in documents related to Cenci properties before the verdict was formally issued. This was not a secret. It was not particularly subtle. Contemporary observers in Rome who paid attention to property transfers read what they were reading. The cardinals who presented the 60 petitions argued from the full documented record. They cited the file on Francesco's conduct, the crimes, the releases on noble bond, the pattern the court had reviewed and declined to interrupt across more than a decade. They cited Beatrice's age. They cited the intercepted letters. They argued that executing a woman for surviving what the law had refused to prevent was not a deterrent to familial violence. It was an instruction about who the law served. Clement VIII considered the argument. He was not moved by it. His stated reason was civic and institutional in character. A recent pattern of violence among Rome's noble families required a public example to establish, without ambiguity, that wealth and title did not exempt a family from the reach of papal law. The argument had a legal foundation. It was not false. It was delivered with the composure of a man who had arrived at his decision before the petitions entered the room. The Romans who heard this reasoning understood it. They understood what a verdict against Beatrice required the court to conclude, that the documented history of what she had survived was not sufficient mitigation. They also understood the Cenci estate and where it was going. The Chroniques Italiennes, which Stendhal compiled from Italian historical records in 1837, preserves the texture of Rome's public atmosphere in those final weeks. The circulation of Beatrice's story through the city's streets, the open conversation about what the Pope stood to gain, the quality of the fury moving through the city's population, not grief yet, but something that precedes it. The scaffold was ordered, the axe was prepared. The crowd management was briefed, because everyone who made decisions in Rome understood that the bridge on September 11 was going to be crowded beyond anything recent memory could supply. The ledger was signed, the transaction was closed. The paperwork, as always, was impeccable. Beatrice Cenci spent her last night inside Castel Sant'Angelo, the fortress that shared a name and a wall with the bridge, where she would die the following morning. The castle had served, across its history, as the mausoleum of an emperor, a papal fortress, a refuge for popes fleeing their own city, and a prison. It held the distinction of being all four simultaneously, depending on which floor you occupied. The cell she was held in during those final weeks was cold and stone, and carried the particular quality of silence that comes from walls thick enough to absorb sound in multiple directions. She had known, for several weeks before it arrived, that the date was September 11. She had known the location, Ponte Sant'Angelo, the Bridge of Angels where the Tiber ran cold and swift in the early autumn. She had known the method. What she did not know, because no one in the administrative record of her final weeks thought to tell her, the historical record of those last nights describes quiet prayer, and what her jailers noted as unusual composure, not the composure of someone who had accepted defeat, but of someone who had finished their accounting and found the numbers clear. She had survived things that would have ended others long before this point. A final night was something she understood how to get through. Stand inside that bridge with her for a moment. The crowd had been assembling since before midnight. By the time the papal guards moved her through the gate and onto the stone, tens of thousands of people were packed between the angel statues and beyond, pressed against the parapets, spilled onto rooftops and architectural ledges, generating a low continuous sound the bridge had not carried before and would not carry again for years. The pressure at the bridge's edges was extreme. Contemporary accounts note that people fell into the Tiber during the proceedings, pushed over the parapet by those behind them, pulled under by the autumn current, drowned in the act of witnessing what Rome had assembled to see. The city had come, not to celebrate. Rome had attended too many executions for celebration. It had come because it understood what this one was, because it had read the petitions, heard the verdict, and knew the name Aldobrandini, and it was going to watch. The execution sequence on September 11, 1599 was administered in the order that papal judicial protocol specified. Giacomo Cenci went first. His execution was protracted and public designed. The official record makes clear, to function as a demonstration of the state's authority over the bodies of those who had challenged it. The crowd did not cheer. Lucrezia Petroni came next. She was brought forward and she met the blade with the composure of a woman who had spent 2 decades inside the Cenci household and had learned, at some level, not to be surprised by what institutions arranged. Then Beatrice. She was 22 years old. She walked across the bridge. The crowd, which had been generating its constant low sound, went quiet as she moved through the space between the angel statues. She did not look at the faces watching her. She did not look at the block. She knelt. She did not turn. The axe fell once. What came out of the crowd's silence was not celebration. Witnesses whose accounts survive in several contemporary sources described something closer to collective grief. A city that had petitioned and written 60 documents and packed a bridge before sunrise, and had watched the calculation conclude the way it was always going to conclude. Bernardo Cenci, 12 years old, had been brought to the scaffold before the sequence began. His death sentence had been commuted at the final hour. His age, in the end, had moved Clement VIII in a way that 60 signed petitions from senior cardinals had not. He was not released. He was repositioned. He was bound to a chair, facing the scaffold. He watched every execution from beginning to end. Giacomo, Lucrezia, Beatrice. When it was finished, he was sentenced to the papal galleys for life. The administrative record notes that the execution was conducted in an orderly fashion and that the public was subsequently dispersed without incident. The bridge was cleared. The Tiber carried away whatever the current took from it. The scaffold was dismantled. The axe was cleaned and returned to its location. Rome went home. The conversation it carried through the streets that morning was not about Francesco Cenci. He had been dead for a year. Nobody had mourned him. It was about the bridge, the axe, and what a pope had counted on his desk before he signed the order. The Cenci estate, Beatrice's inheritance, her family's centuries accumulated fortune, transferred to the Aldobrandini family, with a speed that contemporaries noted was not ceremonial. It was efficient. Clement de Sade died in 160 and 05. The Aldobrandini kept what they had received. Beatrice's grave was marked at San Pietro in Montorio, on the Janiculum hill above Rome. It survived until 1798, when French troops reorganizing the city's symbolic landscape destroyed it. 2 centuries after her execution, she had become what the papacy had not planned for, something the official record had tried to process and close, and could not. Percy Bysshe Shelley staged her story as a 5-act tragedy in 1819. Stendhal returned to the Cenci files in 1837. Alexandre Dumas, Antonin Artaud, Nathaniel Hawthorne. Writers across 2 centuries found in Beatrice something the institution that killed her could not contain. The portrait attributed to Guido Reni, copied and circulated across Europe, became one of the most reproduced images of institutional injustice in Western art. She became more powerful dead than alive. Francesco Scenci's name does not appear in any of it. Michel Foucault, in Discipline and Punish, argued that the public execution under the old regime was never about the criminal. It was about the sovereign. The body on the scaffold was a surface on which the state inscribed its authority, proof that the power to destroy was institutional and belonged to no one else. The lesson is not new. Rome in 1599 was not the first institution to prosecute a survivor rather than a perpetrator, or to discover that a tribunal held over the victim produces a more manageable spectacle than one held over the crime. The machinery runs more smoothly when the accused cannot speak clearly to what prompted them. The Tudors understood this. So did every court that has ever needed an enemy it could execute in public and a ledger it could close afterward. Today, tourists cross Ponte Sant'Angelo between the angel statues. They photograph the castle at the far end. Some of them stop to look at the Tiber. The bridge that carried Beatrice Cenci on September 11, 1599 now carries millions of visitors each year. The stone holds what happened. None of them can see it. The stone doesn't tell. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If this story changed how you understand what the word justice meant to a pope who was counting a dead girl's estate, subscribe, hit the like button, and share it with someone who needs to see it. You have just watched another premium documentary from Velours Spectre. Click the video appearing on your screen right now. The descent into the past continues.